Hi, everybody. This is Nick Brubulis. I'm the editor of Educational Theory. This is another in a series of interviews we're doing with authors and guest editors in the journal. Today, our guest is Rose Ylimaki, who, along with her colleagues, guest edited a set of a symposium that is a really interesting collection of papers. And let me get the title right, A Cross-National Dialogue on Education and Pedagogy. Rose, thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me, and thank you for the opportunity to edit the special issue.
Sure. Well, that's great. So let's just start generally with the overall project in the issue, which is to use different international perspectives to do a deeper dive into this word that people use a lot, but don't often define or clarify, which is the idea of pedagogy. Um, why did you focus on that particular term? And what are some of the notions that are wrapped up in the idea of pedagogy that would be different from related terms like teaching or instruction? Why pedagogy?
Sure. So this cross-national dialogue started about 5 years ago, maybe even a little bit earlier than that. And it came from a number of us who were in different fields of
Mhm.
education that referred to pedagogy without, similar definitions or definitions at all. So I'm in educational leadership primarily, but also curriculum studies. My colleague Dan Kastner is in curriculum studies and early childhood, and Todd Price is in teacher education. And we're all in, US scholars, but have been involved in dialogue with scholars from, well, more Western European countries, but Germany in particular, and also the Nordic countries. And what we came to realize is that we all talked about education and pedagogy, but we didn't mean the same thing
Mhm.
necessarily. And we didn't really have, at least we felt we didn't have a strong root in pedagogy and education more broadly. So all of us had taken courses in, a philosophy course or a history of education course, and, had read John Dewey primarily. And but not a lot beyond that. And as education has become so much more politicized in the US and elsewhere, and this has increased over the 5 years we've been in dialogue tremendously. So, instrumentalization on the one hand. And then on the other hand, concerns about choice and diversity and equity and all of these kinds of things. And so we went more deeply to look at this tension, and starting with John Dewey in particular, and democracy and education, and his understanding of a dialectic and how to manage these tensions. But he's also a pragmatist. So you get a lot of integrated work, as you know, that comes into Dewey. And so then we thought, okay, let's read the roots of Dewey, which is Hegelian, but otherwise. And that took us to wanting to have counterparts and dialogue with people from Germany primarily, which is where Dewey's roots were. And so we've worked with Norm Friesen, who has been doing other things, so he hasn't been involved as recently, but Anya Kraus, who is in Sweden, but she's German educated, Agnes Frang, who's an early childhood scholar and knows pedagogy well, and she's German educated. And then we've also been in dialogue with Christoph Wolff and others who have this, very deep understanding of education. And so we've been reading, and this has gone on. I think I said 5 years. It's probably earlier than that. I know it is, in fact, because we were in dialogue with Michael Uljans, who's in Finland, with a Nordic understanding of German thinkers. And so just really felt like we needed to take a deeper dive. We needed to read. We needed to be in conversation. We needed to be in workshops. So it's been, 5 years, and now we're producing a special issue, which explores in many ways this sort of forgotten understanding. It's tacit. The understandings are there, obviously, historically. And even in our own work and the roots that are there, but they didn't have a language, and they certainly did not have a common language. So Agnes Frang and Dan Kastner, who are in the first paper after the introduction that describes the project, have taken this to looking at this forgotten notion of pedagogy and its understandings in terms like pedagogical relation
Mhm.
and intentionality and the practical roots of that. And so they've really kind of taken us to that. And then Anya Kraus and I went into the history a bit more, looking at the history of continental pedagogy and where we could see the connections with earlier dialogues, primarily John Dewey. And so we just actually took two scholars, two theorists. We took John Dewey and part of his work from My Pedagogic Creed and Democracy in Education, and put that in dialogue actually with Hannah Arendt, who is a German educated political philosopher, actually, but she understands education. And so she and Dewey, they debated in certain ways, but they also came to agreement around not making children instruments of politics and understanding education as it is connected to democracy, diversity, all of those kinds of pieces we talk about and argue about now, but we really don't have the language for. So we went more deeply into their work. And then we really thought we needed to look more broadly at the history. So Todd Price looked at John Stuart Mill around the history of diversity in particular and choice. And he became in dialogue with Ruprecht Mattig, who is German educated, worked with Christoph Wolff. And he took us to further understandings of Bildung and Wilhelm von Humboldt, who we know about Bildung from, but we didn't know his understandings of culture and diversity. That doesn't seem to be as widely cited in the literature. And so we took that to a deeper root. And then Christoph Wolff helped us really wrap this around education of what it means to be human. And if you understand that, well, then what is pedagogy? It must have a pedagogical relation. It must have an intergenerational or transgenerational perspective. What do we want from young people, right? What does an older generation want, and what do we want to honor from younger generations? And so that's really where we are with, I think, with this special issue.
Yeah, thank you for that, Rose. I think that's an excellent overview of the papers and the overall sort of purpose and direction of the discussion. It's interesting, this isn't exclusively a discussion of Dewey or pragmatism. We just did a symposium a few issues back on sort of the emerging European rediscovery of Dewey, particularly in Germany and in other countries in Northern Europe. Linda Stone calls it the third wave of pragmatism. And it is interesting, knowing Dewey well and thinking of him in some ways as a kind of quintessentially American philosopher of education. It's interesting to see how he's being taken up by European scholars and through that really revealing new aspects or dimensions of Dewey's thought.
Exactly. It's also interesting. It's not in these papers. It will be it be upcoming, but we've realized that Du Bois
Hmm.
had actually journeyed to Germany, spent time in Berlin at the Humboldt, and we knew that, but we didn't realize he had written papers at the time that are in an archive in
Hmm.
Berlin. And he talks about how he was treated as a human being
Hmm.
in Germany at that particular point in time. He could not get his doctorate there. He spent time, he had to come back to the US. He studied with William James, who
Hmm.
is Dewey's counterpart in certain ways of that
Sure.
generation of pragmatism, but was also a transcendentalist. And when you look at the conversations that Du Bois was involved in Germany, you can see the root of William James and those conversations around Hegel and Souls of Black Folks
Hmm.
and the educational traces and the pedagogical traces that are there. We're really looking into that now. That's one of the next pieces.
That's an interesting aspect of genealogy. Okay, so I'm interested in talking with you about the benefits of a specifically international, cross-national discussion or dialogue on the notion of pedagogy. And one of the things that interests me is the issue of language.
Yes.
That it isn't just different national contexts or national cultures, but specifically language. And in the context of this discussion, I think it's very revealing. You've already mentioned Bildung, how certain specific concepts, Bildung, didactics, pedagogics, which are common in German and in some of the other Northern European languages, create a different vocabulary for thinking about educational issues. In some cases, there's not a direct equivalence or translation in English for some of these concepts. And I think it's interesting, and I think several of the papers show how
Yeah.
bringing in this broader vocabulary helps to illuminate aspects of education, in this case specifically, different meanings of pedagogy that are, I think, fresh and
Yes.
maybe even surprising or different to people who have only encountered this discussion within American and English speaking contexts.
Exactly. And we have read about Bildung,
Mm,
and we put that in dialogue with Dewey's notion of growth, which
mm,
isn't a perfect translation
mm,
either,
right,
but is also not something that has been recently
mm,
articulated in terms of pedagogy.
right,
And so when we did a series of workshops with looking specifically at language and terminology.
mm,
I'm glad you asked about that. I'd almost forgotten when we're doing it, but in terms of how it informed this issue.
mm,
And so we just would take one word like growth and Bildung and put them into dialogue.
mm,
And then we took the pedagogical relation and put that into dialogue and took an historical dive into that. And it was so interesting, at least on the US side of the dialogue, to think about how pedagogical relation is really what is in the controversial phrase now, social emotional learning, that is being um, eliminated or banned or whatever you want to say in many states, including Arizona, where I work now.
sure,
And yet, if you look at that, the notion of pedagogical relation is key, is absolutely essential and foundational to
sure.
pedagogy. And so to be able to see that now gives us a fresh view of the more aesthetic, the more social emotional pieces of that pedagogical teaching relationship that happens between teachers and students.
Yeah, I like that very much. And of course, that relational perspective can be traced in large part to Hegel,
Yes,
who also, of course, had a huge influence on Dewey. So that
yes,
kind of closes the circle in a way.
it does. Yes, it does. Very interesting and helpful. So you wonder, so what Dewey took from Hegel in his theories, are they sufficient for the contemporary situation? In
Mhm,
some ways, yes, in other ways, no.
mhm.
So it gives us a place to take a dialogue forward with our generation and with the next generation of scholars and teachers.
Absolutely. And as you say, it's not part of this discussion, but I'll be interested to see where this project goes. It may be that sources like Du Bois become an important supplement to this discussion and maybe do contribute some perspectives that, in some ways, I think maybe obviously do tie into some of the contemporary concerns and debates, not only in the US, but in other countries.
Exactly. That's what we're thinking.
Yeah,
It will be an upcoming workshop, not this next one. The next one is going to be on the Lehrplan and the curriculum counterpart in the US.
great.
Dan and Agnes are going to do that one.
Good. Rose, thank you very much for this conversation. This obviously isn't everything that's in the symposium. There's a link here for people who want to read more. I really do encourage folks to dive in. The papers are really interesting, and as I've said a couple of times, really help to shed, I think, fresh perspectives on what people might think of as fairly familiar topics like Dewey or growth or pedagogy. So thanks for this contribution.
Thank you so much. We appreciate the opportunity. It's helped us move forward as well. So thank you.